Shangyin, Yu's Memorial Stele. The emperor of the Yuanhe era was martial and heroic, the very incarnation of the Yellow Emperor or Fu Xi. He swore to avenge all insults to his house, and all nations brought him tribute in the Hall of Justice. Bandits had ruled west of the Huai for 50 years, where wolves begat lynxes and lynxes seared bears. They held the mountains and rivers, and they spread into the plains, their long lances and sharp spears challenging even the sun. The emperor found a wise minister. His name was Pei Du. When the rebels tried to kill him, by a miracle, he survived. Prime Minister seals at his waist, he was made campaign commander. On a dark day, in a cold wind, he raised the emperor's banner. His 4 great generals became his teeth and claws. A young man from the Ministry of Rights became his adjutant, an adjutant who was both wise and brave. His troops were panthers, 140,000 strong. They attacked Caizhou, dragged the rebels to the ancestral temple in chains. The success was incomparable, the imperial gratitude immeasurable. The emperor said, "Du, you are first in achievement. Your adjutant, Han Yu, should write an inscription in your honor." Yu bowed his head to the floor, then rose with dancing hands and feet, saying, "I have some talent at inscriptions on metal and stone. Since antiquity, tasks like this were entrusted to great writers, and although it is outside the scope of my official duties, it has always been said, do not defer doing what is right." When he finished, the emperor nodded his approval. Yu withdrew to purify himself, then sitting in a small pavilion, he drenched his great brush in ink. He chose and amended phrases from the canon of Yao and the canon of Shun, and drew words from the Qing Miao and the Sheng Ming odes. At last this marvelous work was done and written on fine paper. The next morning, paying his respects, he laid it on the crimson steps. He submitted it, saying, "I, your servant, not fearing death, have recorded these great accomplishments to be carved on a stele." The stele was 30 feet tall, each character as big as a bushel. His words were mounted on a sacred tortoise and decorated with dragons. The language was lofty, the words obscure. Few understood it. He was slandered to the emperor. They said he concealed some censure in these words. 100-foot rope pulled the grand stele down. With coarse sand and great stones, they ground away his words. Yet his marvelous writing was like the primeval breath. It had already entered into the hearts and minds of all the people. Shang, Tang's basin and Confucius's tripod bore such inscriptions. The objects themselves are lost, but the words survived. Alas, past wise emperors and wise ministers had their accomplishments commemorated, so they shine brightly even now. But if you want to display Han Yu's marvelous writings to coming ages, how will you be a match for the 3 sages or the 5 wise kings? I wish I could write 10,000 copies or chant it 10,000 times, until my mouth ran with drool and my right hand was gnarled and calloused. I would transmit it onward for 72 generations to a king who would carve it on jade as the foundation of his audience hall. So, here we have today the first poem in this anthology by Shangyin. Now, most of the poets represented in this anthology are represented with 1, 2, 3, 5 poems. Not a lot, mostly 1. But there are 4 poets that are represented with more than 20 poems. The first is Du Fu, 30-something, I think. Next, Li Bai. Then Wang Wei, who is in the 20-somethings. And the last one, still in the 20s, I think 24, is Li Shangyin. So he's clearly considered by the anthologists as one of the great poets of the Tang dynasty. He is the first poet also to come from the late Tang period. So let's very briefly introduce Li Shangyin and the late Tang. So Li Shangyin was a poet of the late Tang period. And he led, let's start with the Late Tang period. The Late Tang period generally, the starting date is about 820 or 835. 820 is the year of the assassination of the Yuanhe era emperor by a eunuch. 835 is a year in which an attempt by some of the scholar officials and the bureaucracy to do away with eunuch control of the court was thwarted. So whatever date we choose, the Late Tang period occupies the second half, most of the second half, and the ending of the 9th century. It was a time of political decline. In the Mid-Tang, during the Yuanhe era, the emperor, as can be seen in what is described in this poem that we have just read, the emperor, I say, was able to recover part of the power, part of the authority that the emperors had lost after the Anlushan rebellion. After the rebellion, great parts of the country in the east and the north had become completely self-governing principalities that paid only lip service to the court. They were the military commissioner territories under the military governors, the Yedushi. Now, Emperor Shenzong, the Yuanhe era emperor, had managed to and some of his predecessors as well, had managed to recover part of the imperial power, launch offensives, and force the submission of these military commissioners. But after the death of the Yuanhe emperor, the situation, the decline continued to accelerate, and it went forth unimpeded. So most of the later rulers were quite incompetent. The eunuchs were quite powerful. They put the emperors under their thumb, and they became powerful and corrupt. The economy started to go down. There were economic crises. There were floods. And the only thing that allowed the Tang to continue to survive for almost a century was basically the lack of exterior pressure at the time. Nevertheless, in the late 9th century, massive peasant rebellions broke out in the south. One of them, the Huang Chao rebellion, managed to completely disrupt the empire and even to sack the capital. And after that, the Tang dynasty was, just a moniker with a puppet emperor in the throne. And the empire would finally disappear as an empire at the beginning of the 10th century, when the military governors finally carved out the whole empire into different states. So the late Tang was a time of decline, of perceived political, economic, social decline, of increasing xenophobia and cultural self-centeredness, including persecution campaigns against Buddhism. And it was a time of intense factionalism at court. So into this world comes Li Shangyin. Li Shangyin was quite a brilliant young man. And, he got entangled into those factional struggles in the court. At his time, there were basically two parties, the followers of the Li faction and the followers of the new faction. And in the beginning of his career, he was patronized by the news, but afterwards he made a marriage into the Li clan, so he became ostracized, and he never rose to, in spite of passing important examinations, he never rose to any position of any preeminence. He was only given sinecures at the imperial court. Now, the other important thing that we can say about Li Shangyin, he is the best poet of the later Tang. In fact, he and Du Mu are usually paired with, so the Li and Du of the late Tang are equated with the Li and Du of the high Tang, with Li Bai and Du Fu. And so he and Du Mu are considered the best poets of the late Tang period. And in this time, literature became very, very dark, very pedantic, very, very obscure, very baroque. And Li Shangyin is probably the best representative of this type of writing. His style had a reputation for being notoriously dark and difficult and symbolic and difficult to grasp. So densely elusive, difficult to understand. Still, he makes a big contribution to this anthology, although I suppose the easiest to understand poems were chosen here. Because remember, the 300 Tang Poems anthology is an anthology of good Tang poets, of the best, but it was designed for children's education, actually, as a first encounter, as a first teaching of Tang poetry, its forms, its styles, and so on. So it chooses simple poems whenever it can. Okay, let's go on to the poem then. So what is this poem about? So this poem basically tells a story. Han Yu, who we've encountered in the past, was, as we know, a servant of the emperor of the Yuanhe era. And here an anecdote is told how he participated in the pacification of a rebel province, the province of Huaishi, in the service of Prime Minister Peidu. After the successful military campaign, he was asked to write a stele commemorating the victory. But conspiring enemies at court contributed to have the stele erased and therefore partially destroyed. Still, the text, even though the stele was eliminated, the blueprint, the original text, which was copied into the stele, perdured. And Li Shangyin in this poem is commemorating Han Yu and his writings. And indirectly, he's also commemorating Han Yu's and his emperor's era, the Yuanhe era, which, in contrast to Li Shangjing's The Present Times, was a time when was a time that would have appeared, if not golden, at least silvery, to the people who lived in the last years of the dynasty. It would have been seen as the time of an attempt of a restoration of imperial power and glory, harkening back to the high days of the Tang dynasty. So the topic of this poem is an inscription, and the background behind that inscription, the morally just and praised military campaign against the rebels under the Yuanhe emperor. But of course, it's also about slander, about merit, virtuous scholars being slandered, which is, a position in which Li Shangjing and most of the late Tang poets would have felt themselves comfortable in seeing themselves as, the victims of factional struggle and slander. So it would be easy for them to identify with a maligned Han Yu. Also, another important topic of the poem that is reflected through its topic and especially through the reflections in the last part of the poem is the idea of the perenniality of virtuous and beautiful writing. However many attempts might be made to destroy and might succeed in destroying physical written texts, inscriptions, if they are truly virtuous and meritorious and aesthetically worthy, they will last in the minds of the people and in the minds of the scholars. So all the attempts at destroying Han Yu's memorial stele prove unsuccessful because the text itself, even if not in the stele, lives on to this day. Interesting thing in this case about the inclusion of this poem in the anthology. This poem rings in very curious parallel but contrasting elements with Han Yu's Elegy for the Stone Drums, of which we talked about a few days ago. There, Han Yu was praising and trying to preserve this heritage piece of inscription from the remote past, which he believed belonged to the time of another restorer emperor, Emperor Xuan of the Western Zhou dynasty, who was a blueprint for his own Emperor Xian of the Tang dynasty, an emperor who was able to restore the splendors of the house. And this image is replicated in Li Shangjing's poem. If the Elegy of Stone Drums talks about King Xuan who rose in anger and brought tribute from the different areas, this poem talks of the anger of the emperor of the Yuanhe era, making an explicit comparison, which was only implicit perhaps in the Stone Drums Elegy of Han Yu. Again, there's the interest in the lastingness of an inscription. So in the case of Han Yu's poem, it was this old inscription from the remote past, the fear at it being lost. Here we talk about an inscription, a recent inscription by Han Yu, which was indeed lost. In fact, it was obliterated by imperial command, but which continues to last in written form. So these two poems make a perfect couple, and they seem to play between themselves and their meanings. They establish a very interesting intertextual relationship. Okay, time is passing, and we've already gone through 15 minutes, so let's go to the poem and to its different sections. So very briefly, I'd say there are probably two big sections in this poem, and the first section could be divided further. So the first part of the poem, which occupies most of it, is a narration. So it's quite a prosaic story, perhaps imitating the style of Han Yu's memorial Stele, I imagine. And this tells the story how in the Yuanhe era all these battles happened under Peidu, the wise minister, and how Han Yu, working for Peidu, wrote this inscription, how this inscription was good, but how it was slandered. So the whole story. And you could subdivide this section into, many subsections, like the emperor, the first three couplets or so, with the emperor deciding to act, the next couplets describing Peidu and the military campaign, the next couplets describing the commission given by the emperor to Han Yu to write the Stele, and the last couplets describing the erasure, the destruction of this Stele because of calumny. And the second part of the poem clearly is more of a meta-literary or a literary criticism part or section, which reflects on the fact that original inscriptions from the past have been lost, but their texts, through copies, have been preserved. So the objects themselves are lost, but the words survived. And it's important because merit and memory of the past and of the good deeds of the past can only perdure through these inscriptions, through these texts, through these poems, and especially when they are the work of virtuous men who are crafty at making beautiful and virtuous words like Han Yu. So let's go couplet by couplet as usual. The emperor of the Yuanhe era was martial and heroic, the very incarnation of the Yellow Emperor of Fuxi. He swore to avenge all insults to his house, and all nations brought him tribute in the Hall of Justice. So as I said, the first first two couplets present us the emperor. This emperor of the Yuanhe era is a warlike emperor. He's not a pacifist, and he's compared, albeit, in a hyperbolic manner, to the Yellow Emperor and Fuxi, who were almost mythical, godlike founders of civilization. And he's avenging the insults to his house. That is to say, he's trying to restore the power of the imperial clan after the after effects of the Anushan rebellion. And he seems to be successful. All nations brought him tribute in the Hall of Justice in the capital. But now a specific conflict is going to be mentioned, probably one of the most successful of the military campaigns for imperial restoration under Emperor Xianzong, under the emperor of the Yuanhe era. Bandits had ruled west of the Huai for 50 years, where wolves begat lynxes and lynxes served bears. They held the mountains and rivers, and they spread into the plains, their long lances and sharp spears challenging even the sun. So all is not so peaceful, really. There are areas out of the imperial control, out of the imperial pale, and one of them is the province of Huaishi. Most of the provinces of the Yelushi, of the rebel military commanders, were in the north and northeast of the country, especially in the area of Hebei, but there were some areas to the south. And imperial policy first focused on, subduing these southern areas, especially the one that is talked about here, Huaishi, west of the Huai, because this was a strategically located territory that could block the flow from the Grand Canal to the capital, which was the lifeline of the Tang dynasty after the Anushan rebellion. The south had remained loyal and without autonomous military leaders for the most part, so the rice and the tribute from the south floated up the Yangtze, then the Grand Canal, then the Yellow River, and arrived and helped to sustain the imperial capital in the extreme northwest of the empire. So this region, Huaishi, has been for half a century ruled by these animal-like, savage, vicious military commanders who are proud and boastful and heavily armed. Campaign is directed against them. The emperor found a wise minister. His name was Peidu. When the rebels tried to kill him, by a miracle, he survived. Prime Minister seals at his waist. He was made campaign commander. On a dark day, in a cold wind, he raised the emperor's banner. So this is a very melodramatic episode in the history of the Tang dynasty. So the military commanders were no fools. They very soon perceived that Emperor Shenzong's efforts were pushing towards the submission of the military commanders one by one. So they conspired against the emperor, and one of the conspiracies was an assassination attempt on his prime minister, which was successful. And the same assassin tried to murder Peidu, and who was a minister but not the prime minister, who got away almost miraculously. He was hit in the head and fell into a ditch, but he had a special hat that protected him from death. So after this assassination attempt, the effect was the contrary to what the assassins had tried. The emperor vested full powers on Peidu as chancellor, and a military campaign was directed against the state of Huaishi, from which the assassins were presumed to have come. So the campaign against Huaishi begins. It was a hard campaign of many years that was worn through, a lot of difficulty. So Peidu goes west. He's not a general, but he is the commander of the whole campaign. His 4 great generals became his teeth and claws. A young man from the Ministry of Rights became his adjutant. An adjutant who was both wise and brave. His troops were panthers, 140,000 strong. They attacked Zaizhou, dragged the rebels to the ancestral temple in chains. So the campaign was staged. As I said, it was hard fought, but it was successful, mainly through a very daring attack by a general, one of the generals called Li Su, who made a night attack through storm and wind and I think snow, and managed to take the rebel capital, Zaizhou, unprepared for the assault. So the rebels are defeated, they're taken to the capital, their general is executed. That is not mentioned in the poem. And so, success. Consequences. The success was incomparable, the imperial gratitude immeasurable. The emperor said, "Do, you are first in achievement. Your adjutant, Han Yu, should write an inscription in your honor." So as a reward, among other things, Peidu gets an inscription that will be written by his adjutant to honor him. So we get the imperial commission. Let a stele be written honoring your martial prowess, your success at conducting this campaign against the rebels, against our majesty. And we already got introduced a few lines back to Han Yu. He was an adjutant who was both wise and brave. So this adjutant is going to write the inscription. And now we hear him in his own voice. Yu bowed his head to the floor, then rose with dancing hands and feet, saying, "I have some talent at inscriptions on metal and stone. Since antiquity, tasks like this were entrusted to greater writers, and although it is outside the scope of my official duties, it has always been said, do not defer doing what is right." So, in the accustomed modesty with which scholar officials were supposed to direct themselves to the court, Han Yu is taking up the challenge. He says, "It's an honor. Better writers than me could probably do this and have done this type of texts in the past, but I'll do my best." When he finished, the emperor nodded his approval. Yu withdrew to purify himself. Then, sitting in a small pavilion, he drenched his great brush in ink. He chose the amended phrases from the canon of Yao and the canon of Shun, and drew words from the Qing Miao and the Shangyin odes. So he composes this stele. Remember, Han Yu was a master of the Gu Wen movement. He was the representative of the attempt to go back to antiquity and imitate the style of antiquity. And he was opposed to what he considered the effeminate, effete, ornamental and vacuous style of Pianwen, of parallel writing, that until his day, since the period of disunion, had been the staple fare for state documents. In the texts that are mentioned as inspiration, we get this link to the writings of the past. It's the canonical texts that inspire Han Yu's writing. The Canon of Yao and the Canon of Shun are two texts that idealize a mythical and cosmic view of emperorship, and that begin the Shangshu, or the Shujing, the classic of documents, one of the sacred Confucian classics. The Qingmiao and the Shengming are poems, among the lofty poems that are part of the anthology that was also canonical, the Shijing, the classic of poetry. So he inspires himself in the most canonical of ancient texts, borrowing their diction and their ideas. At last, this marvelous work was done and written on fine paper. The next morning, paying his respects, he laid it on the crimson steps. He submitted it, saying, I, your servant, not fearing death, have recorded these great accomplishments to be carved on a stele. So the work is completed, and it's presented at the feet of the emperor, at the feet, in the crimson steps towards the imperial throne. What happens with this text? Well, it's going to be inscribed. The stele was 30 feet tall, each character as big as a bushel. His words were mounted on a sacred tortoise and decorated with dragons. The language was lofty, the words obscure. Few understood it. He was slandered to the emperor. They said he concealed some censure in these words. 100-foot rope pulled the grand stele down. With coarse sand and great stones they ground away his words. So the zenith and the fall immediately follow each other. The stele is inscribed. This sort of stele is with a big turtle at the bottom of the stele and dragons on the sides are very representative of this period. Some of them still exist and can be viewed in Shangyin and in other places. The beautiful stele is made, but the language is obscure. Characters are dark. Han Yu, as a restorer of ancient styles, had a tendency towards using unusual and little-known characters from the writings of the past, and his court enemies use this as an opportunity to slander him. And the slander is effective. The inscription is obliterated, and the words are ground away. Actually, it's not just a matter of slander. From what I've read elsewhere, it seems that Han Yu's inscription minimized or did not mention at all the role of General Li Su, the general who had in fact been the one to attack and take Zaizhou. And in fact, the wife of this general had complained to the court, and then others added their voices. But that was the real reason why the stele was eliminated. But of course, Li Shangyin is glorifying Han Yu, so he just recurs to the common trope of the calumniators, of the slanderers at court, criticizing the good, the sage scholar. So the stele has been destroyed, alas. Or has it? Yet his marvelous writing was like the primeval breath. It had already entered into the hearts and minds of all the people. So, of course, we had already read in the poem that a first copy had been made on fine paper. The fact that the stele was eliminated physically, or at least the inscription on it was eliminated, did not destroy the text. The text would continue, and because it's virtuous, Li Shangyin says, and it's a very clear statement, it had already entered into the hearts and minds of all the people. So, no matter what the evil or the stupid or the slanderers might try to do to destroy a good man's texts and reputations, his words will live on. The people will remember them. Everybody, so also the scholar officials. Shang Tang's basin and Confucius's tripod bore such inscriptions. The objects themselves are lost, but the words survived. So an exemplar. Li Shangyin, so he's probably being a little bit pedantic, is mentioning here two examples of famous inscriptions in his day where the original objects had disappeared. Shangtang's basin, that appears, I think, in the Great Learning or the Doctrine of the Mean, one of the Confucian texts. So there it is mentioned that the King Tang of the Shang dynasty, who had been, according to Confucians, one of the good, one of the virtuous kings, had a silver basin, I think, inscribed with the words, "Day by day make it new." There's renew yourself. Strive to be a good, hard-working person. And Confucius' tripod, that's another rather obscure anecdote. Not Confucius himself, but I think in the Shiji it is mentioned that his grandfather, Confucius' grandfather, had an inscription on a tripod which represented his family tradition. And the inscription read, "One command from the king, I bend my head. A second command, I bend my neck. A third command, I bend my body. I run along the wall and people don't insult me. Here's my porridge, here's my congee. With it, I feed my mouth." So, an inscription denotating loyalty. Again, no tripod by Confucius existed by the time of the Tang dynasty, but this inscription was remembered. It appeared in the Elegy, I think. Oh, as well. Anyway, after these exempla, the important thing is that the objects themselves are lost, but the words survived. Alas, past wise emperors and wise ministers had their accomplishments commemorated, so they shine brightly even now. But if you won't display Han Yu's marvelous writing to coming ages, how will you be a match for the 3 sages and the 5 wise kings? So the aere perennus, this concept that Latin poetry also has of words more immortal than bronze or stone, is literally exemplified by Han Yu's writing. And here Li Shangyin is making a plea. Just like those sage and wise kings of antiquity are remembered because writings honored them, how can the emperor of the Zhuanghe era and his achievements be remembered if not by Han Yu's writings and by their continuing survival and by their being read and cultivated in the present? Evidently, Li Shangyin is a partisan of these texts and of his heroic Han Yu as a writer of virtue and a commemorator of glory and victory. I wish I could write 10,000 copies or chant it 10,000 times until my mouth ran with drool and my right hand was gnarled and calloused. I would transmit it onward for 72 generations to a king who would carve it on jade as the foundation of his audience hall. So the poem concludes with Li Shangjing's desire to be able to copy this wonderful inscription, to retain it, to copy it by hand or to sing it by heart, so that it will last forever, and that someday when a virtuous ruler comes to the throne, he will use it, he will inscribe it in the most precious of materials, jade, and he will use its contents, its ideas, its diction as the foundation for his just and benevolent rule. Li Shangjing's time did not see any virtuous or good rulers that could do this, but the future would.